So I went down another rabbit hole.
He's as polarizing as he is entertaining. Vince McMahon is part renegade, part mogul, and all showman.
All right, so Vincent Kennedy McMahon, former WWE chairman, a person who pushed wrestling and wrestling entertainment, particularly into the mainstream, into a multi-billion-dollar business, but also a part of a growing list of people that I like to refer to as cartoonishly evil.
The Justice Department has announced the indictment of a man who runs the World Wrestling Federation.
This is about crime. This is about breaking the law.
Vince McMahon, his ability to get away with stuff was because he was also this character.
And I have tried but failed often to really compile all of the things that make Vince McMahon truly one of the most repugnant people, undeniably horrible human beings to ever grace entertainment. Like, this dude is super villain awful.
Where does the line between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon end?
And I do feel like every time I've tried to explain to people like, well, how bad is he? It's like, I don't even know where to start. So today, as usual, I'm using my hyperfixation to make a video so that I'm just gonna link. Today we're talking about why Vince McMahon sucks ass. And it's a long time coming because I've been planning to make a video on him for a hot minute. But it seems like the longer I go not making the video, there's more and more reasons to hate him. And I figure with the recent release of the Netflix documentary, Mr. McMahon, that goes into some of his controversies and some of the reason why he's a truly repugnant human being, I'm gonna go in and help a little bit, make a little bit more context, because they just glazed over. Actually, the documentary ends up being largely just like a crash course in the history of WWE and kind of like greater things that turned it into this big business, which fine, if you care, that's fine. But if you're talking about Vince McMahon, I want to know. But before we get started on that, hi, I'm Kendall. If you're new around here, welcome. Not new around here, what is up, home scale biscuit? I make videos about everything, it seems. I think it's important, before I go into a long diatribe about how much I hate Vince McMahon, to talk a bit about my history with wrestling, if you're new to the channel. Here and there, I've talked about it, but growing up, I was a wrestling girly. I was sitting down on my parents' carpet in 2002 to 2006-ish, watching wrestling like it was a soap opera. Like, that was my stories. And it kind of was. That's kind of what wrestling is, really. It's a soap opera with storylines and predetermined things that happen, arcs. People are villains and then they turn heroes or vice versa.
Pro wrestling has always been a soap opera. Here's your hero, here's your villain, here's your damsel in distress.
And it's a very compelling thing to watch. I used to record it on VHS. And if you go to my parents' home to this day, there is a giant like storage bin are just filled with tape after tape after tape of SmackDown, Raw, sometimes ECW. Those are my stories. And I was hooked, baby. This is predating YouTube, so you couldn't just look it up. And after it was done, it was done. That was the story, you were gone. And I had to keep up with my stories. It's hard to say why child me was so compelled by wrestling. It probably has something to do with a bunch of muscular men in Speedos, oiled up, wet, fighting each other. And also, like, the divas were what I aspired to be, really hot. I mean, to this day, one of my husbands is Roman Reigns. My boyfriend, or get over it. I briefly wanted to be a WWE diva because, again, they were hot, but also it was like, ooh, beating the shit out of people while in bra and panties. I don't know why it felt like, ooh, cool, like a superhero. And then I got older and I was like, something's a little what's going on there? I thought I was gonna marry John Cena, where he was a wigger.
Word life. This is basic thugonomics. This is basic thugonomics.
He put spinners on the WWE Championship and blinged it out, and he would come out rapping while wearing jorts and basketball jerseys. Embarrassing for him, but also for me. But one of the fixtures of wrestling, and is kind of inextricable from wrestling, is its chairman, former chairman now, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who was also an on-screen villain and was portrayed as the character, quote unquote, of Mr. McMahon, the evil boss that the wrestlers would buck up against, to buck up against the system. He was depraved, disgusting, sexual deviant, abusive to everyone. He was an equal opportunity abusive dick. And over the years, though, in very wrestling fashion, there had been a lot of debate about how much the character of Mr. McMahon and the real person, Vince McMahon, how much they were similar, if at all. As a child, I did chalk up Vince McMahon's character, quote unquote, as a character. I was never a kid that thought wrestling was real. And my sister used to piss me off. Like, this ain't real. I know, bitch. It's a soap opera. But because wrestling was wild. It was wild. I cannot express in words how wild it was. I watched this along with Jerry Springer and Maury. It's trash television, and I love it. But I did associate Vince with more of a character of being this just outrageous, horrible person. But recent events have shed a light on that distinction. Allegedly. It's not that far off. And today we're going to talk about it. Mentioning a bit about Mr. McMahon, the documentary, using that as kind of like a timeline framework to some degree, and use that as we continue on in the ongoing story of him stepping down from WWE and is currently in the midst of a DOJ investigation into sex trafficking, amongst many other allegations. I gotta say, the last few years have really been the year of people getting taken down for sex trafficking, eh? I hope Diddy rots. Speaking of the documentary, some of the reason why they don't go into more of the current accusations, it started filming before the accusations were public. The taping with Vince McMahon in particular stopped when the allegations were made public. So most of the interviews that are taking place, there's a level of emotional neutrality because these other claims weren't made public. But rest assured, even before those claims, there were plenty to hate Vince McMahon for. The documentary could only do so much considering, one, Vince was participating in it, and two, there was a major development in his life. He had a lot going on. But first, before I ruin your entire day, and this video is not going to be monetized, I don't foresee a future in which this video is monetized, but hey, maybe. Either way, let's send it over to Admiral Kenny just in case. Hello everyone, this is Admiral Kenny, and today's video is sponsored by Mint Mobile. Godsend, I said this last time and I'm still saying it because my internet's still acting dookie booty, but you know what is working? My 5G that I was able to buy months in advance with prepaid plans with Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is the mobile carrier that doesn't have brick and mortar stores so that they're able to pass those savings on to you. That combined with bulk buying where you can pay in advance for months of service and customized family plans, you're able to save loads while still getting the reliable coverage of the T-Mobile network. I actually told my dad how much 3 months of coverage was for me. He's like, that's how much I pay for one person for 1 month, and I still don't have unlimited data. So my dad's like, I think I'm gonna join Mint Mobile because what? That's disgusting. And now if we do a family plan, I'll save even more money. You can choose a data plan that fits you best. You can do 5, 15, 20 gigabyte, or you can go all the way up to unlimited. And all plans include unlimited text and talk, as well as data on the nation's largest 5G network, plus free calling to Mexico and Canada, as well as included hotspot tethering. All you gotta do is sign up and activate via SIM card. You can actually get an eSIM card, that's what I did, from the comfort of your own home. You can keep your phone number and all your existing contacts. And when you do the switch over, and if you ever need assistance, they have a very, very, very good care team. So if you would like to check out Mint Mobile, feel free to click on the link down below or the QR code that's floating somewhere near my big noggin to get an unlimited plan for only $15 a month for the first 3 months for all new customers. Big thanks to Mint Mobile for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get on to the debauchery. So again, a bit more of my history of wrestling and being a wrestling fan. Again, I started watching it when I was a kid. I kept up with the storylines. I watched them turn heel, which is to be turn evil or watch them turn babyface, which is to be good. Those are terms in wrestling. I watched WrestleMania on pay-per-view several years in a row. I begged my parents to let me watch it. And again, I didn't subscribe to this idea of it being real. I was very well aware that there's patterns. I noticed certain like story arc. That's kind of when I started to get bored with wrestling as a kid. I started to notice like story patterns. And it just got a little uninteresting for me. And I think for a lot of people, him being so terrible on screen, which we don't have enough time to talk about all the terrible things he did on screen and storylines that he made, by the way. Again, I chalked it up to him being part of the entertainment of wrestling. But back in 2020, something kind of big happened. and I had a lot of time at home. And during the pandemic, I found myself kind of just bored. And one of the things that I picked up during that time was revisiting wrestling. That's when I discovered Roman Reigns and how he is mine. That is my man. I know he's married, has very many kids. I know I have a boyfriend who's loving him, whatever, but in my mind, Roman Reigns and me, like this. Love him. That's where I discovered some other wrestlers that I was like, why is everybody sexy? Anyway, as I slowly became a regular watcher of wrestling, this time as an adult, I left it pretty early because there were so many things that I just couldn't ignore now in the lens of an adult. And this is prior to researching Vince McMahon, right? There was just me watching wrestling and saying, something ain't right here. And I remember at the time as a child too, also feeling that a little bit when I started to notice all my favorite wrestlers were dying really early. We'll get to that. What are the work conditions here? Like what is your health insurance package for jumping off of a steel cage? What is your health insurance package for a steel chair to the face? Like, sure, I know that wrestling isn't real in the sense that it is scripted and that it's predetermined. And there's certainly techniques to lessen the impact on the body. But the way gravity works, regardless if you're trying to fake it or not, you can only brace yourself so much from falling on a chair or tables or another person. And I remember there was one distinct match and I had put a clip of it on Twitter and I had to go find it. Oh, oh my God. Just stay down. Oh my God. And that was when that thought happened. I was like, what the fuck? I would soon find out that, spoiler, even to this day, conditions at wrestling aren't great. But that was the beginning of me going into the rabbit hole that is the world and the safety, quote unquote, created by Vince McMahon that is absent. Like, it's not there. Well, it's there. It's better than it was before. But rest assured, that's just because it's good for business. I had also noticed when returning to wrestling that a lot had changed. A lot of the storylines had calmed down a lot. A lot less rape. There was a lot of rape. Women were treated as they weren't really treated as the athletes that they undeniably were. They were mostly like bikini models, essentially, to ogle at, or a Playboy model.
It is time to stop your grinning and drop your linen.
Super objectified.
You know, bra and panty matches? I'm not sure that that would be suggested today.
And or a damsel in distress for like another male wrestler's storyline. And I started to say, I wonder what forced that change, because I definitely remember some storylines from the early 2000s being hella rapey. The first one that comes to mind is the thing with Kurt Angle and Booker T, where Kurt Angle wanted to his wife, and it got very racist and very rapey very quickly.
I want to have sex with your wife. And I'm not just talking any kind of sex with your wife. You know, that kind of bestiality sex with your wife. What I want with your wife, Charmel, I want to have that kind of perverted sex.
I also noticed the return of a lot of very old wrestlers. If I'm not mistaken, The Undertaker had just retired or was about to retire. I don't remember. Like, he had recently retired within the last few years, I think. And I was like, pardon? That was wrestling 20 years back when I was watching it 20 years ago. What do you mean? Or the fact that they keep bringing out Hulk Hogan, who's a bitch, by the way, in real life. Terrible person, racist asshole. We'll talk more about him later, but that's a side note. And Ric Flair, who's like, is he even still alive? He's only 75? He's looked almost dead for years. What the hell? I thought he was way older than 75. Okay. I thought he was 92. I was like, Jesus Christ. It just seemed like people that should not be here are still here. Why? And sure, yeah, you know, the love of the game, but there's something that told me like a logistic issue. Do y'all have money? Are you okay? What is going on? And I'm sure they have money. But, you know, I was just asking questions like, why do people not leave? But I say all that to say that I definitely noticed that there was something smelly afoot. A smelly smell that smells like boo-boo. I hate that I accidentally had some foreshadowing. I want to die. Okay. So again, the documentary is pretty much just like a timeline of the rise in popularity of WWE, and then talks often quite vaguely of the machinations of Vince in the background. I think its best moments are when it sheds light on his relationship with his children and how that is, as well as the honestly disturbing moments of artistry, fakery, but blurring a lot of lines between reality and fiction in a way that he's just so dehumanizing. That's what it all boils down to. So much of Vince's mentality and singular focus is if it's good for business. Don't focus on the things of the past. Don't focus on the things that hurt you in the past. Everything is about going forward. And what is forward is making money. If it's good for business, everything is fair game. I cannot stress that enough. They talk a bit about his upbringing that may explain some of where that viewpoint comes from. And, you know, hyperbole aside, I call him the devil or whatever, but people that are as abusive as Vince McMahon are people, and they're usually that abusive because they were abused in many ways and didn't access the very necessary help that he obviously needed. So much of Vince is the dehumanization of people, the chess playing of people, his ability to manipulate emotion. He's a Virgo. That's all I'm gonna say. I dated one Virgo man, never again. You can keep that shit. That noise. Not doing it. He played with emotion. He appealed to the vulnerabilities of people around him. In some of the instances of people around him, he was very kind. And I don't negate that. Do I think that outweighs the very disturbing and damaging things that he did? No, not at all. If anything, it just explains this sort of Stockholm syndrome type of relationship that I feel a lot of wrestlers around him seem to have. In the documentary, they bring up a lot how many of the wrestlers refer to him as sort of a father figure. And that's beyond him as a boss, right? There's something emotionally driven to the concept of your boss being seen as your father figure. He made you who you are. He used his power and influence and unbelievable wealth, and he blessed you with a chant. And in some ways, depending on the person, he may have even blessed you with his ability to obfuscate the terrible things that he does and maybe shields you because, again, it's good for business. And so it kind of explains that very like Stockholm syndrome relationship that a lot of wrestlers seem to have with him. But rest assured, he's burned a lot of bridges, and hopefully he will burn in hell. If you would like a bit more granular understanding beyond this video, of course, that you're going to watch all the way through, about why Vince is a terrible person, I highly recommend Behind the Bastards podcast that I love for a lot of reasons. If you want to know why a lot of people are terrible people, great podcast for that. But they have like a 6-parter on Vince McMahon. There's also a really good YouTube video essay called The Downfall of Vince McMahon by a YouTube channel called Seeking Answers. I really liked that video as well. I think those two plus the documentary. Oh, there's also another show called The Dark Side of the Ring, which I've also watched a lot of, explains a lot of these controversies with a lot of wrestlers. But in many ways, most likely, if it happened when Vince was controlling wrestling, he probably had a hand in covering it up. So Vince first got his start in wrestling promotion because his father was a promoter, and his father was a promoter. Vince McMahon Sr. was head of the northeastern territory of wrestling. And for the first 12 years of Vince McMahon Jr.'s life, he did not know who his father was. His mother was a single parent who he alluded to often sexually assaulting him. He would be physically abused by the men that would come into her life as well. Ultimately, he would meet his biological father, Vince Sr., when he was 12 years old.
It's almost like my dad had a glow about him. I ran up to him, open arms, expecting to have this big hug. And I got a, on the back, kind of like, hey, boy, that's a little bit different.
He could point at his dad and say, that's what I aspire to.
And that, it saddens me. I'm sorry. I'm a human being that empathizes with human beings. To have for the first 12 years of your life, these incredibly formative years of your life, no understanding of who your father was, and to find this person and he's now taking care of you, and you imagine all these things and dream all these things that relationship could be, only to be met with Vince Sr., who wasn't great. But it would seem that much of Vince Jr.'s life was devoted to proving his worthiness to his father, which is a cycle that Vince Jr. would repeat onto his own son, by the way. Hurt people, man. And Vince McMahon Jr., the one that we know, he hurt a lot of people. Eventually, he would prove himself to his father to some degree in that he was able to buy his wrestling company from him. And eventually, he would start to aspire to move their wrestling company into other territories within the country. So at this time, wrestling was a very almost gang thing in the United States. There were companies that handled certain parts in the United States. There was somewhere that handled, the South. There was Northeast. There was the Midwest. And then there was the coasts and stuff like that. There was very much so territories, and wrestlers existed within those territories. And the thought of encroaching on those territories was those fighting words. Vince McMahon said, I don't give a f***. I'm going to each place and I'm going to take your best wrestlers. I'm going to offer them more money. I'm going to offer them more deals. They're coming with me. So as you can imagine, he made a lot of enemies that way. As Vince would tell it, it's just business. It's just business what it does. What it do? If I screw over people, if I cheat, which is a reoccurring theme in the documentary as well, hey, I won.
Building. And if you can't compete with me, it's America. Tough.
Now, this would cause a lot of strife between him and his father, but eventually when this would grow into something bigger and obviously prove to be a success, I guess that's when his father would say, you're cool and I'm proud of you, and then die. So, in the grand scheme of terrible things that Vince McMahon does, encroaching on other territories, this breach of propriety is very low on his list of offenses for me, personally. But it does, again, say a lot about how he views things. He views his power in the takeover, his power in cheating. If you get your hands dirty, that's what you gotta do. If you gotta hide things, that's what you gotta do. If you gotta break things, that's what you gotta do. Everything is permissible in the name of business. Speaking of breaking propriety, one of the things that Vince would do with then World Wrestling Federation, it would later return to World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, because the World Wildlife Fund sued for that. But I'm going to use them interchangeably, whatever. But yes, WWE. One of the things he would utilize is like real life political strife going on. So when the US didn't have great relations with Iran, he was like, what would be great? Utilizing anti-Iranian sentiment by having all-American wrestler, super American Hulk Hogan go against the Iron Sheik, who was from Iran. It sounds so midway. Iran. The passion that a lot of these wrestling fans felt was their way of working out their own xenophobia.
He's from another country, man. From another country.
And their Islamophobia and yada, 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 That was just one of the early storylines that were really meant to shake the audience, to bring you to emotion. And that's very much so an art form in and of itself. But the problem is Vince McMahon, again, never felt like anything was off limits. And so over the years, as we go through the 80s, into the 90s, and into the 2000s, it got very, very weird.
A recent simulated castration scene.
I see sand people.
What's good in the hood?
Just holding it down, trying to take care of business.
Keep it up. I'm a
But again, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So WWE, whatever, would continue to grow through the 80s exponentially, but rest assured that growth had a cost, and that cost were wrestlers. At this time, they were wrestling 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. They were wrestling every fucking day. And if you didn't wrestle, you didn't get paid. So if you were injured, you didn't wrestle, you didn't get paid. If you were so exhausted that you're about to die from exhaustion, keep in mind that they're also working out and, spoiler, using a ton of steroids and abusing painkillers because I'm sure you're in pain doing all this shit. You had to do all those things and get your ass out there and go wrestle because otherwise you don't get paid. And as bad as that sounds, sure, these days their contracts, one, they have contracts. It's not as bad as it used to be in the 80s where they were wrestling every day. I think it is still important to note that is, to this day, according to the WWE website, wrestlers are independent contractors. If you're not quite sure what that means they are not considered employees. They're independent contractors, meaning that the WWE doesn't have to protect certain things for them as employees. They don't have to provide healthcare outside of, immediate ring stuff, so they have to get their own health care. They're not protected under certain employment laws, like anti-discrimination laws, anti-retaliation laws, wrongful termination stuff. They're not necessarily covered for those things. And I couldn't see that being an issue ever. Now, with that said, that's not to say that wrestlers didn't try to unionize. As a matter of fact, Jesse the Body Ventura tried to get a union going, but here comes head Hulk Hogan. Again, I don't like him. Hey, Vince, did you know they're trying to make a union? And so he ratted everybody out, and Vince told everybody, if y'all join a union, you're getting fired. And Hulk Hogan's like, well, I had to tell my boy, because, we're good boys. He's the reason why Hulkamania is running around. You. But yes, wrestling would become more and more mainstream with Hulk Hogan going into movies and acting. There was also some collaborations with very big mainstream celebrities. Cyndi Lauper at the height of her music career, collaborations with MTV, Mr. T at the height of his popularity. There were also some less than ideal situations that happened with wrestlers around this time.
Doctor now says I have ear damage that's probably permanent.
When I let him go, he fell and hit his head.
I sued Mr. T, I sued Hulk Hogan, I sued Vince McMahon, I sued the World Wrestling Federation. I sued them all.
It is important to note, though, that Vince McMahon wasn't just treating wrestlers badly. He was also protecting wrestlers who treated other people badly. For instance, allegedly. So in 1983, a wrestler by the name of Jimmy Snuka, who was one of WWE's big names at the time, called the ambulance saying that his girlfriend had hurt herself. She would later be pronounced dead of an apparent homicide. 4 months prior to her death, she had tried to press charges against Snuka for DV. It would be found that Vince McMahon had tried to convince her to not go forth with DV charges because that would make him look bad. And if I recall correctly, he was a babyface. So for a babyface to get arrested for DV, that would really just shake things up, and we just can't have that. It's bad for a business. So when she died, somehow, some way, even though there was no other person that could have been accused of her murder, Jimmy Snuka just didn't go to jail. For 32 years, they didn't do shit. It was open. He just didn't go to jail. And I wonder why that is. I'm sure Vince had nothing to do with that. He would eventually be charged 32 years later in 2015, but he was deemed unfit to stand trial because he was dying of stomach cancer already. So he ended up dying a few years after that anyway. There's also the Pat Patterson issue. Pat Patterson was a retired wrestler, but he would also be a booker for WWF 80s into the 90s, if I recall correctly. But he would be accused of sexually assaulting ring boys who were teenagers often, who would put the ring up and take the ring down, as well as some of the other just men around the company, some of which would accuse Vince of firing them out of retaliation if they said anything about it or didn't go along with Pat's advances.
This is on my testicles, on my buttocks by Pat Patterson of the World Wrestling Federation, and Terry Garvin propositioned me when I was 16, offered me cocaine and all kinds of drugs to have sex with him. When I refused, I was let go from the company when I was 16.
Eventually, Vince settled with Tom Cole, Mel Phillips, and Terry Garvin. They were let go and never worked there again.
91, after I refused a sexual advancement from Vince McMahon's buddy, the vice president of operations.
Pat Patterson.
Yeah. There is no question Vince not only knew it was going on, but it certainly wouldn't be a surprise or any shock that he was involved himself.
Did he cover up? And did he take part?
I made knowledge of it to you when I was fired, and you just blew it off and let me go. I retained a lawyer.
Because you were not very good. You were not a very good announcer. You could not. That's the only reason why you were fired. You could not make the transition from radio to television.
And you chose, over the course of 1 year of negotiations, that I would be the man for that job. I didn't sleep with your vice president. 2 weeks later, I'm fired.
Here's your job. You want to keep your job, you do it. If you don't want to keep your job, you don't do it.
In the documentary, there's sizable people that do believe that Pat Patterson was innocent. They were like, there's no evidence, blah, 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 blah. And there is something to be said that maybe he had more eyes on him because he was the first openly gay wrestler. You know, it does, you know, some people like to say terrible shit about gay men in general, especially of this time, about them being predators when that's not necessarily true. But I also think it's important to remember men are a lot less likely to come forth about being victims of assault, and you had several of them. I think there's something to be said about that. And that's even before we get to the documentary where Tony Atlas, he corroborates that he didn't like Pat because he would grab him by the genitalia. He laughs about this, but this is not a laughing matter.
He's the booker. He's the #2 guy in the office. Who's you gonna complain to?
Vince.
For what? To get fired? He needed Pat more than he needed me.
There's also, though this was never proven, there's also clips of Rowdy Roddy Piper talking about how him and Pat Patterson didn't have a great relationship. And though he never says outright that he was harmed or assaulted by Pat Patterson, that's a visceral face of a traumatized man who can't make sense of something.
Pat Patterson doesn't like me.
It's a political thing? Was he trying to keep you down?
No. I was a pretty little kid, believe it or not, one time, and it just got awkward. That's all.
He made you awkward, and you held a grudge.
Or I did, whatever, you know.
That's all to say that there's a lot to suggest that Vince McMahon had a hand in covering up major incidents, and at best was grossly negligent about what was going on with his wrestlers and the people that he employed. And that's just some of the examples of things that he got accused of covering up for other wrestlers. We didn't even touch on shit he did when he was directly accused of being the first female referee. Her name is Rita Chatterton. She claimed in '86 that he had assaulted her, threatening that if she would not perform his wishes sexually, that she would be blackballed from the industry. She would go significantly more public with these accusations in the early 90s. And I was like, people aren't great about victims coming out now. But as you can imagine, it was great in the early 90s.
Just didn't resonate with a public that it should have resonated with.
Rita, if it really happened, why did you wait?
Well, I can't answer her question as far as the Mets and what happened
No, but
there.
I want you to speak for yourself on the question of delay.
What happened with me is, at that time, you people don't understand wrestling. Nobody talks, for one. No one talks.
They just thought it was like a woman making up a story on a rich guy.
Rita, what do you expect to get now? I mean, what do you want? Did you just want to come on Geraldo, or?
It was absolutely taken with all the seriousness that it deserves. Not that I really needed anything to convince me that Vince is capable of such violence against women, but it doesn't help that in reference to this situation, during the documentary, which was filmed in 2021, Vince said it didn't happen. And if it had happened, the statute of limitations had passed.
Consensual, and actually, had it been, the statute of limitations had run out. So, I mean, it's all kind of crap like that people are digging up.
which is the most innocent way anyone could talk about anything. Which is ironic that he would say that, because in the next year, there was the New York Adult Survivors Act that allowed people to press civil charges against their assailants. So in 2023, I'm pretty sure that was settled with a multi-million-dollar settlement. It's not much, but it, you know, little victories. But I do think it says a lot about our culture at this time period that the prospect of Vince McMahon being a violent sexual deviant who possibly covered up murder, who definitely covered up murder, wasn't as big of a story as the prospect of him possibly selling illegal anabolic steroids to his wrestlers, because that he actually went to court for. WWF Dr. George Sahorian would be put on trial for selling anabolic steroids to the wrestlers. This could be my ignorance showing, but yeah, like, why is this news? Like, look at these. Yes, they are roided up. And like, I don't know. I also got to remember I'm looking at this from the lens of a person in 2024, because there's a lot safer ways to take anabolic steroids now. But to be honest with you, I think the key issue that a lot of people had is the concept of these wrestlers cheating for these bodies, right? And that was bad. That was the problem. And, you know, you're a and probably covered up the murder of a 23-year-old woman by one of your wrestlers, but you know, that's just business. This is cheating, and you can't do that. Good to know that our priorities have always been great. Also, speaking of business, during this trial, which really impacted the WWF, nearly put them out of business, and it didn't help that they had a competitor, WCW, that was gaining popularity amongst their viewer demographic. They had also recently gotten star player of WWF, Hulk Hogan, to join. Also, WCW was a more gritty and more like grungy, bad boy type wrestling versus the kind of like more family friendly at the time, superhero-ish wrestling of the WWE. So you compile this big scandal of steroids on top of that. It was not a good time for business. With that said, even though Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan had been at odds because he had left to go to a competitor, Hulk Hogan would testify for Vince that he didn't sell steroids or he didn't force wrestlers to take steroids, yada, yada, yada. Again, in the grand scheme of offenses of Vince McMahon, this one is very low on them, because much as Tony Atlas would say, he was taking steroids before he met Vince McMahon. Like, Vince McMahon wasn't making wrestlers take steroids, as I understand it. You would notice a pattern that the bigger dudes would get more airtime, and maybe that would make people want to take more steroids. Those bigger dudes would get more airtime and more storylines, and maybe you can put two and two together. I would imagine to even get that far, a lot of them were already on steroids. If anything, he was just turning a blind eye to it. Again, with the and murder cover-up, I'm glad that our priorities are straight. Vince McMahon will be found innocent, by the way. I will say it was very funny on trial. He needed to get neck surgery, so he comes in with a cartoonish neck brace. But he's innocent. Dr. Zahorian, though, goes to jail for 3 years, and after he leaves out, he's still able to practice, you know, whatever. But the WWF was definitely reeling from the steroid trial, right? Also, WCW would continue to kind of start this war that was waging between WWE and WCW. They were poaching more and more of their biggest talent. They were offering them more money.
You didn't see any similarity to sort of what you were doing in the territories?
No, Ted's philosophy was, let's go hurt. I'm going to hurt my competitor. And that's not mine. I want to go compete.
Hulk Hogan to join, and he had turned heel over there, which was like a big deal because he was this big baby face. I'm a real American. I hate that song, but damn it, it's catchy. I don't subscribe to the ideologies of American pride. But the fact that song is catchy pisses me off. Anyway, he turned heel and was a part of the NWO, which is the New World Order of wrestling. With WCW, they were not putting them under slave contracts where they have to wrestle 7 days a week and all that shit. They were like, no, work better hours. They can like have a life and family and like maybe heal a bit from like, I don't know, getting punched in the eye.
But you said that your philosophy is different than Ted's. Like he's trying to hurt the person.
Correct. Some would think it might be hypocritical for me to say, okay, I don't hurt someone else. I just do what's best for me. Yet when someone comes after me, I don't think they have the right. Sure, they have the right. Again, what I say a lot of times is totally different than what I think.
And one of the people that they would end up getting is Bret Hart. And Bret Hart was a big name for WWF. He was one of the few stars that were left at this point. And he would go to Vince and say, I'm going to go to WCW. But at the time, he was still the heavyweight champion. So Vince McMahon said, well, if you're going to leave, you got to lose the match that's upcoming with you and Shawn Michaels so that the championship stays with the WWF. Bret didn't want to do that because him and Shawn Michaels were going at it in real life, which is a reoccurring thing with wrestlers. We have storylines of them going at it. They actually hated each other sometimes. And this was one of those situations. Shawn in the documentary would say that, you know, at the time it was a very rough time in his life and yada, yada, yada. He was a real dick. And some of the like fighting they would do on screen would have real life consequences. Like Shawn Michaels saying that Bret Hart was cheating on his wife. And he was like, I have a wife and kids. Like, no, that's real. You crossing the line now. And so Bret Hart didn't want to give him the match, and Vince McMahon was like, okay, well, if you don't want to give him the championship, we'll take it. So what they did in the middle of Montreal, which is Bret Hart's hometown, what they would do is there would be a match and Shawn Michaels would put him into the sharpshooter. It's a submission hold. And it's the other guy's submission hold. So it's like a big deal. Like, oh my God, you're using his submission hold. He puts him in the submission hold. Bret Hart does not tap out. But Vince McMahon is telling the timekeeper, ring the fucking bell. Bret Hart loses in a way that everyone knew he just got over. Like the entire audience, everyone watching was like, what? And this was a big deal.
14 years I've given Vince McMahon. I bled for him. I've took front turnbuckles at 100 miles an hour. I've given him Christmas mornings with my kids that never happened. None of that meant anything.
This would be known as the Montreal Screwjob. Bret in the documentary talks a lot about how angry he was because he was already going to WCW. So he took this time to spit in Vince McMahon's face.
I got him bullseye right into my eye.
And give him a black eye behind the scenes. I get it. And so this was one of the first opportunities for audiences to really see the villain that is Vince McMahon. And this would have been in like the mid 90s or so. So this is where the character Vince McMahon will become more of a thing. Like behind the scenes, we know he's a piece of shit. And like the WWE keeps falling into a bunch of like issues. But now we're really seeing the caricature. Is it a caricature? Again, that's the infinite question. I think he's just a terrible person, but this is his freest way of being that terrible person where he can do it for an audience and he can do it in obfuscation where people think, well, it's just fantasy, but also, wow, this character sucks ass. And also make a lot of money from that he would become the biggest villain of WWF. He was the biggest heel because in real life, he was a piece of shit. It was this bringing in of real life stories and real life scandals and real life things that honestly, if anyone with a conscience would have been too ashamed to show their face. But instead, Vince McMahon said, I can make money off of that. I can turn that into a soap opera that the crowd can enjoy. This would be the beginning of another pivot of WWF and what would be known as the Attitude Era. That's when they would get darker going against their competitor WCW. They would bring in faces that you might recognize, such as Dwayne The Rock Johnson. He used to be so fine. He kind of looked like a cue ball to me now, but back then, when he had the sunglasses on and the real arched eyebrow and he used to do it, oh! That's also when Stone Cold Steve Austin would start to make an appearance. He was originally on ECW, if I remember correctly. So he was this rough tumble guy. ECW was that's a side note. ECW was like the extreme championship wrestling, I think it was. So let the bodies hit the floor. They shouldn't have put people through that. It was barbed wire. It was chairs. TLC matches, right? Tables, ladders, and chairs. Lighting on fire. It was a lot. Anyway, Steve Austin was on that. And he would come over to WWE and he would end up being a baby face, but in a way that was very new for WWE in the sense that he was an anti-hero.
I said, and that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so.
He was bucking against the billionaire boss. This allowed people to feel like this catharsis because the terrible billionaire boss that Vince obviously liked to play would get his comeuppance, beat up, shaved bald, made to cry. And again, all of it was good for ratings. Also around this time is when Triple H and Shawn Michaels would make Generation X, a lot of crotch stuff, a lot of crotch shots, a lot of naked or semi-naked women. It got really sexist and really rapey and really racist. Elements of that would persist well into the 2000s when I would start watching wrestling, right?
It was still family friendly. No one got killed. There was, no
Come on out, you
use of knives or guns or anything like that.
But within this emerging era, we would have glimpses of Vince McMahon's real life callousness. And I think one example of that, particularly that is very palpable, is the death of Bret Hart's brother, Owen Hart. Now, Owen Hart would stay with the WWF, even though Bret Hart would go to WCW after the Screwjob, right? After Vince McMahon screwed him. He would have a character that was a superhero that would fly down with a harness into the ring. It was something that he had done several times. And during a live show, his harness would malfunction and he would drop into the ring and die. Now, this awful, horrible situation, theoretically, the only response to that is to stop the show, one would think. But no. Vince McMahon said, well, the house lights were down, so no one saw him fall. They just saw his lifeless body in the ring bleeding and paramedics working on him. But, no one saw him fall. We got all these people here. Yeah, the show must go on. And so, Vince McMahon made them continue the show, even though their friend, their fellow competitor, they just watched die and have his lifeless body rushed past them right before they're forced to go out to the ring.
They wheeled my dead brother right past all the wrestlers and actually pushed wrestlers out the door and said, go, 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 you're on.
And do a little song and dance and a little chuck and a jive for the audience because the house audience didn't know he was dead. They knew he was injured. They did not know he was dead. On television, they had announced that he had died. But at the time, it was a big issue. They were like, why did you continue the show? And he's like, well, I think he would have wanted it. I think he would have wanted the show to go on. He was a great competitor, blah, blah, blah. It was a horrible accident. It wasn't our fault. What, we got to stop the show? And so I'm like, okay, it's been over 20 years since that happened at this point. This happened in 99 and he's interviewed in 2021. So I'm like, surely 22 years have passed and you have perhaps said maybe that wasn't the best idea. Nope.
Not just my son. It had been me who was splattering with that, as Brett said. I would want the show to go on.
This is the instance that I think is the most concise in explaining the type of deplorable human being Vince McMahon is. Because whenever I've had this conversation with people that aren't particularly familiar with wrestling, they're like, well, what's so bad about him? This is a good, quick, concise story. If you needed references. This does it, okay? But rest assured, there's many other instances of him just being a terrible, demon, horrible person. Particularly one that will do anything for a show, a spectacle. A lot of it is very cartoonish, like storylines that he would create, some of which would, again, blur the lines of things that were really happening in real life and then turning that into stories. Some that I have written down here, including, but of course not limited to. I mentioned that Vince McMahon's children, Stephanie and Shane McMahon, would show up a lot in storylines, as well as his wife, Linda McMahon, at some points. But that was also in an effort to lend to the reality, of the wrestling. One of the storylines he made his daughter do was to be roofied by Triple H and married while unconscious in a Vegas drive-thru. Triple H would then say that they, quote, consummated the marriage many times. And for some reason, instead of being horrified at this storyline of it turned into Stephanie McMahon is a slut. So she would be called a slut from the audience every week. She ended up becoming quite a heel of the show. She's like the bad guy. They hated her. And sure, as disturbing as that story is, Vince McMahon is like, man, this is money. Let's do more. Eventually, though, they would end up real life dating, Stephanie McMahon and Triple H. And they got married in real life. They are married. Actually, Paul Levesque, that's his real name. Triple H, he's actually on the board currently of WWE. When they were real life getting married, Vince McMahon said, why don't we sell it for pay-per-view? This is one of the few situations in which Stephanie McMahon said no. He would call her selfish and then write in a street match with him, Vince McMahon versus Stephanie McMahon in the ring 6 days prior to her real life wedding.
I remember my mom actually threatening my dad that if I had a black eye or a broken ankle for my wedding, that she would divorce him on the spot. I may have gotten choked out in the match, but that's a little bit different.
Actually, there was a lot of shit with Triple H in particular. There was the necrophilia arc where he was going against another wrestler named Kane who wears a mask, and Triple H dressed in his mask and got naked in a real funeral home, I found out later. Simulated necrophilia with a mannequin in the funeral home. But there were some storylines that even his children were like, nah, including the one where he would Vince would impregnate Stephanie.
Is only the second time I've ever actually said no to him for something he wanted to do.
When she said no to that, he suggested her brother, Shane, which she also declined. As a side note, Shane is weird about that one.
He told this story and we were laughing so hard.
Well, my sister's hot. I don't know if I really would have minded that.
I guess that was supposed to be a joke. I don't find it funny, but okay. Honestly, there was a lot of weirdness with Stephanie.
Every time I went out to dinner with one of your business associates, I was 17 years old. You don't think they told me what you promised them I'd do? And guess what, Dad? I did it. I did it for you, the things I did with them, and I'm ashamed of myself. I'm ashamed of myself that I'm just like you.
Okay, Vince decided he wanted to direct the pre-tape. Vince, this is the look on his face. He had a chair. He pulled it up right next to the couch. And he was like this. This guy is either interested in seeing me kiss Stephanie McMahon or he wants to get off on it.
I don't know. There's something weird with his relationship with Stephanie. His children in general, but his history, by the way, of covering up less than great behavior from wrestlers or people that work around wrestling and the company would continue well into this early 2000s kind of arc. Jerry Lawler was still working his commentary, who was a former wrestler but had he was charged of statutory of a 15-year-old girl in 93. The charges got dropped mysteriously, but that in no way stopped him from being a commentator, and it certainly didn't stop there from being little references to it on air.
I'm not embarrassed to be with younger women, except when I drop them off at school. Well, I ain't going there.
Stone Cold Steve Austin would be arrested for DV, which WWE was aware of and would actively cover up his wife's bruises. I don't know if she was a wrestler or I don't remember, but she would be on camera, and they would cover her bruises up so that she can go out there. Or the fact that they would bring the fabulous Moolah out. I found this out recently. I didn't know this one. Who had a history of being financially predatory, quote unquote, allegedly sex trafficking female wrestlers, but it didn't stop her from being a Hall of Famer. And trust me, there's many, many more. These are just the ones that were the first to come up in some preliminary research, but there's plenty. Just look around. But again, it did seem that the moments in which wrestling storylines would combine real life things was when it was particularly gross. Like, for instance, in 97, a wrestler died, Brian Tillman. He died of a heart attack. And Vince thought in the midst of his war with WCW, this would be great for ratings if we can bring her on to do an interview 24 hours after he died. During a Raw live interview segment of the man that just actually died.
You're distraught, shocked, dismayed over this news, and we thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Or like the time Sable sued WWE in 1999 for sexual harassment and unsafe working conditions, but was probably blackballed and stuff, so eventually she came back to work. But he decided to use her real life accusations to be a storyline about how she lies about sexual harassment and unsafe working conditions.
That Sable sued our company for millions of dollars. that Sable jumped on the bandwagon of any person who's trying to sue our company. It's all about money to her. What did Sable sue for? Sue you? Sue me? She sued us for sexual harassment.
He was also accused of sexual assault in 2006, and that's when he thought it was a great time to write in a storyline about a woman, Mickey James, I believe it was. She had like a psycho arc, but they thought it was a great time for her to lie about being as a storyline. Or the time that he thought, this is messy. I ain't gonna lie, this was kind of this. As far as the other things, a lot lower stakes, but this is really fucked up still. There was Matt Hardy, Lita, Edge. Matt Hardy and Lita had been dating in real life for 6 years, and they were on-screen couple as well. It would come out that Lita had cheated on Matt Hardy with Edge, and Matt Hardy would go public about it, and he would be fired essentially because they're like, you should have stayed more professional, and now it's all out that she cheated on you, and now everybody knows. Because the whole room knew that she cheated on him, everybody knew that there was a lot of bad blood in that room. So when Matt Hardy may or may not, I still don't 100% know if he would break into the stadium and go through the crowd as an audience participant and go to real life beat the shit out of Edge. That was a good time though. I ain't gonna lie, that one's still messy. That one's still good. Since everybody knew that they hated each other and Matt would come out saying real names, he called Edge Adam, which is his real name, on camera. So they're like, wait a second, what's happening? Is this real? What's happening? Yes, them really hated each other. And they were like, okay, since y'all already hate each other and everybody knows, let's turn it into a storyline, baby. They decided to turn Lita and Edge into some of the worst heels on television. And that was a very gross arc. I was there for that one. It was a lot of them just like, and like, oh, and then they had sex on camera, like live, and they like built it up. I remember this. It's probably in one of them VHS things where they were like, we're gonna have sex live on Monday Night Raw. And then Matt Hardy goes out there and beats his ass. I can imagine like that really, she actually cheated on you. You were dating for 6 years and she cheated on you. And now it's her storyline that she cheated on you and the guy that she cheated on you with and him are about to it's funny. That one's funny. It's not funny. It's also like, what the But one of the things that was real life that would always shake me a little bit, even as a child, is when wrestlers would die, right? I mentioned Brian Pillman. His name was Pillman. I think I called him Tillman before. I'm sorry. His name is Pillman. But that was a bit before my time. I noticed that a lot of wrestlers were dropping dead very quickly in the time that I was watching. Two really notable ones were big stars, and that was Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. At this point, I'm like 12 years old, right? I've been watching this a sizable amount of my life now, like 3-4 years. You start to notice, a third of my life I've been watching wrestling at this point. You start to notice a pattern of like people you love dying, like people you enjoy on screen dying, really young, 35, 36, 38. And a lot of times their death kind of had a general pattern, heart attack, sometimes drug overdoses, but there was usually like a pattern to it, enough for me to go, what the is going on over there? Eddie Guerrero would die in that way. He would die of a heart attack, probably of a mixture of steroids and other drugs. But Chris Benoit, who's also one of his best friends, his closest friends, he would die in a way that would put a lot of negative light onto WWE again, particularly how they're taking care of their wrestlers, how they're considering their wrestlers, because he would die in 2007 in double murder suicide. His wife, his little boy, like young kid, and then he would kill himself. There was a lot of talk of the possibility of him doing this being a result of roid rage, which again would put a lot more scrutiny on WWE, considering, again, their past with steroids. But around this time is when we were getting a lot more information around CTE, which is a brain disease that develops from repeated hits to the head. It degenerates the brain and it gets worse and worse over time. That alone can have a lot of effects on emotional regulation, aggression, depression. Chris Benoit is a great example of that because that signature move was a flying headbutt. He would jump from a turnbuckle on his head. Every time he did it, that shit looked like it hurt because it did. It's gravity. And sure, again, you can call it fake, whatever. How do you fake falling on your head in a pile driver? How do you fake getting hit in the face with a steel chair? How do you fake jumping off of a steel cage match? Them getting hit. Until this day, there are many people within and outside of wrestling that said that, you know, he was just a monster. And I'm not here to excuse double murder side by any means. You know, Vince McMahon, and I've heard Paul Heyman too. He's another wrestling announcer type guy who gets, he was also in the documentary. I hate him to bits. Like, I've always hated him. He's so annoying. I don't know a lot about specifics other than just his entire like aura pisses me off, and it always has. But I do remember hearing this like very vehement, like, no, he was a monster. Wrestling had no effect at all on the events that happened, and I just think that's bullshit.
Are you indicating that's my responsibility? These people are dead because...
I'm asking you if it's in any way, shape, or form falls on your shoulders.
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever.
I think it's just an example of all of these sports, they're putting their athletes at risk by playing the sport, because that means, well, how do we defend the sport? How do we play the sport? NFL, people don't want to admit it. Hockey people, FIFA, boxing, UFC. Nobody wants to admit that CTE is the effect of blood sport. Yes, these people are not invincible. They are flying headbutting. And then again, combined with that, then don't give them health care.
They were part of your organization. They worked a couple of hundred nights a year for you. They lived this lifestyle.
Oh my God, you can't believe.
They don't want to acknowledge at all that anything they do in the job can affect them mentally, emotionally, aggression regulation, because it's a lot easier to just say they went crazy, they abused drugs, which is a part of it. I'm not going around saying like, oh yeah, it's cool that Stone Cold Steve Austin was a domestic abuser or that Jimmy Snuka killed his girlfriend. What I'm saying is to act like getting punched in the head on a regular basis, don't mess something up there, is wild. To act like a business that you're on the road 200, 300 days a year, if not every day of the year. They're handing out painkillers like candy. You're getting hit in the face on a regular basis because that's just a part of the job. You're also on a fuck ton of steroids that can also affect aggression and all these other things. To say that the business that you've profited off of and curated and exaggerated had nothing to do is bonkers. He basically just turns it into, well, they were on steroids and they were using recreational drugs and your heart doesn't know which way to go and they died. Even though that had nothing to do with it, quote unquote, they would take a few precautions, like they took out the chair shot. If I'm not mistaken, you're not allowed to do a pile driver anymore, which is where you just bonk somebody straight on their head. They do more like concussion monitoring, playing with the schedule a little bit. A bit more is available for drug rehabilitation. But again, that is not a part of a healthcare package. But with that said, that doesn't stop people from getting concussed. That doesn't stop people from needing 8 billion neck surgeries and shit. But hey, it's for the business. Like disposing of wrestlers, rather firing them unceremoniously with no word like they did Chyna, even though she was women's champion, she just wasn't asked to come back to work. You're in the way for business. Or when they hid late wrestler Ashley Massaro, who died of an apparent in 2019, when she went to them saying that she was assaulted on one of their tours in Kuwait for U.S. soldiers. They told her to not talk about it because that's bad for business.
She spoke with Vince McMahon many times. Vince had his daughter,
Stephanie McMahon,
take his place because she was a female, a woman, and to make Ashley comfortable, and they just played with her.
And that's where she was told this has to stay under wraps.
That is right.
Or if she had gone on and told about the conditions of working at WWE, or the fact that Vince McMahon had propositioned her as well, and when she was denied his advances, he just gave her a bunch of humiliating storylines.
You're gonna cry now.
Vince, don't do this.
You're gonna cry. You're gonna cry.
But making Vince look bad, if it's not on his terms specifically, is bad for business. Because Vince McMahon loves the concept of his business more than he loves the concept of humanity. He feels that as more tangible. It is what feeds the ego of a man who feels as though he's innately lacking and unlovable. To the extent that the idea of retiring is equal to the idea of death, at least according to Vince.
No, I don't see myself ever retiring. I have, like, no sympathy for people like that. Go die.
So imagine my surprise when suddenly he's stepping down in 2022. I hadn't really been paying attention to wrestling much, and then I just happened to hear it. I was like, what? The devil has decided to retire? Well, it would seem that he would originally retire because it had come out that he had been given some hush money to women that he had had consensual affairs with, even though he's their employer. But that would come out in 2022. And Stephanie would take over as new interim CEO and chairman alongside her husband, Triple H. It would come out later that this is a pattern of his that have gone many, many years where he had paid. One report I saw $12 million, a different report said $19 million to several women over a span of 10, 15 years, you know, just a lot of money to hush people up. One of the accusations that would come out is that he allegedly sexually assaulted a woman in a spa in 2011. And in the midst of that, he said, I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna still be on TV. Like, sure, I'm not chairman, but I'm still gonna be seen. He would come back in 2023 as chairman by essentially just changing the entire board. He would merge WWE with UFC to create TKO Group, and at that point he would only own 34% of the company, so he's no longer the major head, and that shows when they told him, you're fired. He had to step down for unknown reasons, and his share was given to Triple H again, but Stephanie would completely resign. And then in January of this year, those allegations from 2022 would become more prevalent. They were now public, the specifics of what was going on in 2022. And he would be accused by an ex-employee of WWE, Janel Grant, in a civil case claiming that he had coerced her into a sexual relationship, trafficked her, violently sexually assaulted her, tried to pimp her out to other executives at WWE. This was corroborated by her uploading text messages from him and giving some very graphic details about the violent exploitation. I'm not going to go into specifics because honestly, it will fuck your day up. There is poop involved. There's also just like very violent assault of women. And honestly, this video has been depressing. If you want to know specifics, you can, I don't want to read it. I just don't want to do it. She also accused him of showing naked pictures of her to other people in the company, including wrestlers, one of which who is unnamed, but is a former wrestler turned UFC fighter who is trying to be tantalized back to the WWE. And Vince McMahon would claim that Janel Grant was part of the deal. This mysterious person, is most likely Brock Lesnar, because that's who fits that description, was a wrestler turned UFC turned, you know. It would seem that Vince McMahon would send sexually explicit photos of her to Brock Lesnar and return back to Janel that, quote, he likes what he sees, and that part of the deal was you. Vince McMahon would give her personal number to Brock Lesnar, and he would request videos of her, also pee-pee poo-poo related, and we're set to schedule a date for that, but it never happened because it was disrupted by a snowstorm. Also important is to remind those who may not be aware that Brock Lesnar's real life wife is a name that we've mentioned in this video, Sable, the wrestler that had accused WWE of sexual misconduct back in '99. So I wonder how she feels about her husband being a part, allegedly, of a sex trafficking scheme by Vince McMahon. I wonder, does she believe it? I'm sure she does. But yes, Janel Grant would claim, and I believe her, that I was not to believe, that Vince and all of these men, including the executives that she was forced to have sexual relationships with, would degrade and humiliate her. Again, if you want to read the text message to corroborate that, you can do that on your own time. It's gross. Ew, icky, don't want to talk about it. But yes, she would claim that he predated on her by offering her a vague job at WWE with no real job description as a cover for trafficking her. And in order to keep her silent, she was coerced into signing an NDA in which Vince McMahon agreed to pay her $3 million, which he did not pay. And now, because that NDA, one, was made under duress most likely, and two, he didn't pay even if it wasn't, she made her claims public, about the things that he had done and is currently suing him, or well, was suing him civilly. But that is currently on pause because it has now been said that the DOJ federal has started a criminal probe into Vince McMahon for sex trafficking. So I guess she said, I'll wait. And I wouldn't be surprised if they bring her in, but I hope he goes to jail, rots in hell, put him on a ship with R. Kelly, Weinstein, Epstein's ghost, the prince that was friends with Epstein, Trump, put them all on a rocket and send it to the moon and blow it up. that is how I feel about it. So if you ever wonder why I hate Vince McMahon, this is a very long video about why. And hopefully I can forget that this fucker ever existed until I hear that he's being sent to the moon and blown up. That'd be great. I've been talking for a long time, so that's all for today. If you liked today's video, feel free to like today's video. If you have other wild stories that you remember from wrestling and people that you hate from wrestling, or stories that I forgot about or didn't know about wrestling, because there's so much. Again, I highly recommend Dark Side of the Ring, the Behind the Bastards thing, YouTube documentaries. People keep up with that shit, okay? Highly recommend those. Y'all like my shirt? It says Meowdy Partner. Okay, that's all for today. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.